The Galactic Council had stood for 12,000 years as the greatest power in the known universe, and 300 different species gathered in the massive orbital station above Velcros Prime, where laws were made and conflicts were solved through careful talk and negotiation. The council chambers stretched half a kilometer across with seats rising up in circles that reached toward the ceiling made of clear material showing the stars beyond. And it was here that the fate of entire civilizations was decided by beings who had mastered space travel long before humans even discovered fire. Admiral Jack Morrison stood in the center of the speaking floor wearing his crisp dark blue uniform. Despite the 6-month journey from Earth, and behind him Ambassador Lisa Grant checked her tablet while keeping her face calm as translator devices. Around them hummed to life and prepared to carry their words to every corner of the vast chamber. The human delegation numbered only 12 people, and they looked very small compared to the hundreds of alien representatives that surrounded them on all sides and stared down at them with eyes that held curiosity and also suspicion. The Zevari Prime Counselor was a towering reptilian creature covered in silver scales, and he raised 3 of his forearms to silence the murmuring crowd, and his voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder rolling across mountains. He informed the human delegation that they would now respond to Resolution 847-Kappa, and reminded them that humanity had been granted provisional membership with the clear understanding that they would follow all established protocols and rules. The counselor continued by listing the problems with human behavior, and stated that their military expansion violated the Armament Limitation Treaty, and their colonial vessels ignored designated frontier boundaries, and their trade practices undercut established economic frameworks that other species had followed for centuries. Lisa stepped forward and her voice carried clearly through the vast space as she spoke and told Counselor Vrex that humanity appreciated the Council's concerns, but they had to point out that humans never signed the Armament Limitation Treaty because they were not present when it was created. She explained that humanity was not there when frontier boundaries were drawn across the galaxy, and their trade practices simply offered better value to consumers across multiple systems, which was fair competition, not cheating. A wave of strange sounds filled the chamber as different species chittered and growled and made electronic buzzing noises that their translators worked to convert into understandable speech. The Mirantine representative was a crystalline being that bent light in confusing patterns, and it spoke next in tones that sounded like breaking glass, and informed the humans that ignorance of law did not grant immunity from it. The crystalline being continued by stating that humanity was informed of these requirements upon first contact, and compliance was not optional for species seeking to become citizens of the galactic community. Admiral Morrison felt his jaw tighten as he listened to these words because he had commanded the Earth Defense Fleet for 8 years, ever since humanity's first meetings with alien species had shown them a galaxy far more crowded and dangerous than anyone had imagined. He had fought against pirates in the Outer Rim, and defended colonies from raiders and lost good people to maintain humanity's small foothold among the stars, and now he was expected to smile and accept chains that would bind his species forever. Morrison spoke with respect in his voice, but there was also an edge that made several nearby representatives lean back in their seats, and he told the counselor that Earth sent them here to establish diplomatic relations, not to surrender their sovereignty. He stated clearly that humans would defend their people and expand to worlds they could make livable, and trade freely with whoever wanted to trade with them, and these were principles that could not be negotiated away. The chamber erupted into chaos as dozens of species spoke at once, and their translators created a terrible noise of competing voices that echoed off the curved walls. The Drex ambassador was a hulking creature that walked on 4 legs and had mandibles that could crush steel, and he slammed a massive limb against his podium hard enough to make it shake, and declared that this was exactly the aggression they had feared. He continued by saying that humans were primitives who discovered faster than light travel barely a generation ago, and they did not get to dictate terms to civilizations that had mastered the stars for thousands of years. Lisa felt her heart racing inside her chest, but she kept her face calm because they had expected resistance, though the sheer hostility radiating from the assembly was almost physical in its intensity. Earth had known this moment would come eventually, and the question had always been whether the Council would negotiate as equals or simply issue an ultimatum backed by overwhelming force. Counselor Vrex made a gesture that dimmed the lights, and activated a harmonic tone that cut through all the noise and restored order to the chaotic assembly. He told the humans that the council recognized their youth and inexperience, and therefore they would offer a choice that was actually quite generous considering the circumstances. He stated that humanity could accept a provisional status with full oversight from council peacekeepers and submit their military to joint command structures and cease all unauthorized expansion for a period of no less than 50 standard years, or they could reject these terms and face immediate sanctions and blockades and, if necessary, military enforcement action. The words hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall, and 50 years of servitude stretched before them like a prison sentence, and 50 years of watching other species dictate humanity's future, while humans had no voice in their own destiny. Morrison and Lisa exchanged a glance, and they had discussed this possibility during the long voyage here while running through scenarios late into the ship's night cycle, when most of the crew was sleeping. Earth's government had given them authority to make the final call if it came to this exact moment, and now that moment had arrived. Admiral Morrison stepped forward until he stood directly before the Prime Counselor's elevated platform, and his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the massive chamber. He said that he supposed they would have to reject those terms. The silence that followed was complete and absolute as 300 species held their breath together, because this was something that had never happened before in the Council's long history. New species always bent to the Council's will eventually, because the alternative was destruction and isolation. And yet here stood these humans refusing to bow. Vrex asked if they understood what they were choosing, and his voice carried the first hint of uncertainty that anyone had heard from him. He reminded them that the Council represented 97% of known civilized space and humanity, would stand alone against the full might of the galactic community. Lisa joined Morrison at the center of the floor and told the counselor that they understood perfectly well. She explained that humanity did not crawl out of one gravity well and fight their way to the stars just to surrender their freedom to a committee of bureaucrats. She said they came here hoping for friendship and mutual respect, but if the price of admission was their independence, then they were not interested in joining this particular club. Morrison allowed himself a cold smile and told them to please send their fleets and send their sanctions and see what happens when they try to cage a species that considers death before dishonor to be a basic life philosophy. Counselor Vrex rose to his full imposing height and declared that the council had no choice and the human delegation was hereby expelled. He stated that effective immediately all council species were prohibited from trade and communication, and cooperation with humanity and human vessels found beyond designated borders would be seized or destroyed, and they had 72 standard hours to evacuate all personnel from neutral territories and return to their claimed systems. The human delegation turned and walked toward the exit as chaos erupted behind them, and species shouted at each other, with some calling for immediate military action, while others urged caution. As they reached their shuttle, the youngest member of the delegation, named Kevin Hayes, looked pale and asked quietly if they had just started a war with the entire galaxy. Admiral Morrison sealed his helmet and looked out at the massive council station where defense platforms were already powering up, and told the young man that they just told the galaxy that humanity was not for sale, and now they would find out if that was brave or suicidal. The shuttle launched, and behind them the Galactic Council descended into chaos. 3 weeks after the rejection that was heard across the galaxy, Captain Ryan Mitchell stood on the bridge of the Earth defense ship Valiant, watching his tactical display with growing interest as his vessel patrolled the outer edge of the Kepler 442 system, which was one of humanity's newest colonies. His ship was a destroyer-class warship equipped with the latest human military technology, and it moved through space with the quiet confidence of a predator that knew its territory well. Lieutenant Amy Peterson called out from the communications station that they were picking up a distress signal, and it was coming from the Valurians, who were transmitting from somewhere in the Graxis Nebula, and they were under attack by raiders who were notorious in this region. Mitchell frowned because the Valurians were a council species and they were an insectoid race known for their merchant fleets and generally peaceful nature, and under the council's sanctions, humanity was forbidden from any contact with them at all. Mitchell asked how far away they were, and his helmsman, Ensign Derek Cole, replied that it would take 23 minutes at maximum burn to reach them. The captain drummed his fingers on his command chair because this was clearly a test of some kind, and either the Council was checking to see if humanity would truly ignore a species in need, or it was a trap designed to catch them violating the sanctions, and either way, he knew exactly what his orders were. Mitchell ordered his crew to set course for the nebula at full speed and sound battle stations, because someone was in trouble and he did not care what the Council said about it. The Valiant's fusion drives flared to life and pushed the ship to its maximum velocity as they raced toward the nebula's edge, and as they approached, the tactical sensors began showing a clear picture of what was happening. 3 Valurian cargo haulers were under attack by 5 raider vessels that were sleek predators bearing no national markings, and the raiders were well known for preying on merchant ships that strayed too far from protected routes. Mitchell ordered his crew to target the raiders and bring all weapons to ready status, and told them to hail the Valurians and inform them that the cavalry had arrived regardless of what the sanctions said. The Valiant emerged from the nebula's interference like a shark rising from dark water, and human railgun technology might have been relatively primitive compared to some Council species' energy weapons, but what the projectiles lacked in sophistication, they made up for in raw kinetic force. The first raider never saw the tungsten round that tore through its engine section and turned the ship into expanding debris. The remaining raiders scattered in obvious surprise because they had not expected a human vessel to suddenly appear and fight with such ferocity. 2 more raiders fell to coordinated missile strikes before the survivors activated their faster-than-light drives and fled into deep space, and the entire engagement lasted less than 4 minutes from start to finish. Mitchell asked for a damage report, and Amy replied that they had minor scoring on the forward hull from energy weapons, but the shields had held, and there were no casualties among the crew. Derek added that the Valurian ships were hailing them and wanting to establish communication. The main view screen showed the image of a Valurian captain, and his compound eyes reflected rainbow patterns of what could only be gratitude mixed with confusion. He identified himself as Captain Trevix of the merchant convoy Delta 7, and said that the humans had saved their lives and cargo, but he had to ask why they would risk violating Council sanctions to aid them. Mitchell leaned forward in his chair and told Captain Trevix that his government might have rejected the Council's terms, but they had not rejected basic decency, and when someone needed help, they provided it with no strings attached. The Valurian's antennae twitched in what humans had learned was a sign of confusion, and he said that the humans gained nothing from this action, and the Council would use this as evidence of human aggression and violation of the restriction order. Mitchell replied that the Council could do whatever they wanted, and maybe they would learn that humanity valued life over politics. He asked if the Valurian ships could make it to safe harbor on their own, and Trevix confirmed that they could, thanks to the human intervention, and he would report this action to his government for whatever that was worth under current circumstances. The channel closed, and Mitchell ordered his ship back to its patrol route, and he filed his report knowing it would make waves back on Earth and in the Council chambers. Sure enough, within days, the story spread across the galactic networks like wildfire, and a human warship had violated sanctions to rescue a Council species from raiders, who would have killed them all. The Council's response came swiftly and was entirely predictable as they issued a formal condemnation and called for increased enforcement of the human blockade. But something unexpected happened that no one had anticipated, and the Valurian government issued a public statement thanking humanity for the rescue and questioning the morality of sanctions that would prevent such life-saving actions from occurring. It was the first domino to fall in what would become a cascade that changed everything. 2 days later, Admiral Morrison sat in his office on Earth's orbital defense station reviewing reports that seemed almost too good to be true, while Lisa Grant stood by the window looking down at the blue-green planet below. Lisa read from her tablet that the Valurians had just announced they were suspending their participation in the sanctions, and they were citing humanitarian concerns and calling for the Council to revisit its position on humanity. Morrison allowed himself a rare smile and said that 1 species out of 300 was a start, but it was better than nothing. Lisa continued scrolling through the reports and told him it was more than just that, because they were seeing increased chatter on galactic channels, and the Harathi colony worlds were publicly questioning the sanctions. Several independent merchants were ignoring the blockade entirely and saying the risk was worth it, because human trade goods were simply better quality at lower prices, and there was something else that was even more significant. She transferred a file to Morrison's screen, and explained that the Arcorian Federation was quietly reaching out through back channels, and they wanted to discuss a possible mutual defense treaty. Morrison's eyes widened in surprise because the Arcorians were a mid-tier military power, and not a council giant, but they were certainly respectable, and if they broke ranks publicly, it would be a significant blow to council unity. Morrison asked why they would do that, and Lisa explained that they were watching the same thing everyone else was watching, and the council was not moving against humanity militarily. They were hesitating, and every day they weighted their position, got weaker, and the Arcorians had been dealing with raider problems in their border regions for years, while the council kept telling them to handle it through diplomatic channels. Meanwhile, humanity had just blown 3 raiders out of space in 4 minutes to save people they had no obligation to help whatsoever. Morrison stood and walked to the window beside Lisa and asked if she was saying that their refusal to back down was making other species question whether the council was really worth following. Lisa confirmed that was exactly what was happening, because the council's power had always been based on the idea that membership was better than standing alone, but humanity was demonstrating that maybe it was possible to be strong and ethical and independent all at the same time. That was terrifying to the council because if other species started thinking the same way, then the whole system would fall apart. A priority alert flashed on Morrison's desk, and he opened it and felt his pulse quicken as he read the contents. He told Lisa she was going to want to see this, and she hurried over and read the message, and her eyes went wide. The Drex were mobilizing their fleet, and they were calling for immediate military action against human space. Morrison pulled up the intelligence reports and asked how many ships they were sending, and Lisa replied that initial reports suggested a battle group of at least 200 vessels, including 3 of their heavy dreadnoughts. They were demanding the council authorize immediate action under the Mutual Defense Charter. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine because this was it, and this was the moment that would determine whether humanity's gamble paid off or led to their extinction. He opened a channel to Earth's military command and ordered them to initiate Protocol Defiant and recall all deep space vessels to defensive positions and activate all reserve fleets. He told them to get him aligned to the Arcorians because it was time to see if they were serious about that mutual defense treaty. As alarms began to sound across the orbital station, Lisa watched ships begin their burn toward rally points, and hundreds of human vessels from massive carriers to nimble destroyers moved with practiced precision toward their assigned positions. 7 weeks ago, humanity had been alone facing the combined might of the galaxy, and now they had at least one ally and possibly more coming, and the council was fracturing from within. The Drex were coming with their fleet of warships, and they would discover what humanity had learned long ago during their own bloody history, that sometimes the fight for freedom was worth any cost. In the council chambers, chaos reigned as species argued over the Drex mobilization, with some supporting it and calling humanity a threat that. The New Horizon colony orbited a yellow star that humanity had named Tau Ceti, and it was home to 50,000 settlers who had left Earth to build a new life among the stars, where agricultural domes dotted the planet's surface, while a small, orbital station served as a hub for mining operations in the asteroid belt. It was a peaceful place far from the conflicts of old Earth, where families could watch their children grow under alien suns and dream of a future filled with hope rather than war. Commander Jake Sullivan had served as the system's defense coordinator for 2 years, and his job had been mostly routine patrols and scanner checks that rarely showed anything more dangerous than the occasional asteroid drift. His small fleet consisted of 6 patrol corvettes and 2 older destroyers named the Guardian and the Sentinel, and it was not exactly a force meant to fight a war, but it was enough to handle pirates and maintain order in the system. That changed completely when the Drex battle group arrived at the edge of the system, like a dark storm cloud blocking out the sun. Ensign Melissa Turner called out from Tactical that they had contact bearing 27 Mark III, and there were multiple faster-than-light signatures appearing. She counted 75 vessels at first, then corrected herself to say 100, and 12 ships, and all of them were classified as Drex warships built for combat and conquest. Jake felt his stomach drop like a stone because 112 ships against his 8 was not a battle but a massacre waiting to happen. The mathematics were brutally simple and completely unforgiving, and he knew that his small fleet could not possibly win this fight through conventional means. He ordered general quarters to be sounded and told his crew to get him a line to the surface and every ship in the system, and to launch all fighters immediately. Lieutenant Paul Henderson from Communications told him that command was saying the relief fleet would arrive in 15 hours, and Admiral Morrison was bringing everything he could scrape together, but the ships were scattered across 3 systems. 15 hours stretched before them like an eternity. And Jake looked at his tactical display, watching the red icons multiply as more Drex ships continued to arrive in system. His fleet had to hold for 15 hours against odds that would make even the most optimistic commander want to cry, but surrender was not an option, because the Drex had a reputation for being brutal conquerors. If they took New Horizon, the settlers would not become prisoners but would instead become examples of what happened to those who defied the Council. Jake broadcast across all channels to every human vessel and to New Horizon colony itself and told them that the Drex had arrived in force and they outnumbered the defenders dramatically. He admitted that the situation looked impossible, but this was their home and these were their people, and humanity did not come to the stars to kneel before tyrants who demanded submission. He ordered all ships to form defensive formation, Alpha 7, and told all non-combat personnel to evacuate to the planet's emergency shelters, while fighter wings prepared for combat launch. The lead Drex vessel was a massive dreadnought 3 times the size of Jake's largest destroyer, and it opened a communication channel. The Drex commander appeared on screen, and his mandibles clicked together with what might have been amusement, as he identified himself as war leader Craxus of the Drex Imperial Fleet. He stated that the humans were in violation of Galactic Council sanctions, and they had 10 minutes to surrender their vessels and submit to Council authority. Jake straightened in his chair and told war leader Craxus that this was a human colony, in sovereign human space, and the Drex were the ones in violation of territorial rights and basic galactic norms against unprovoked military aggression. He gave them 10 seconds to turn around and leave, or humanity would consider their presence an act of war. Craxus's mandibles spread wider in what was definitely a laugh, and he said that human bravado was entertaining but completely futile. He pointed out that he had 112 warships while the humans had only 8 patrol craft, and this was not a battle, but a lesson in obedience that needed to be taught. Jake replied that he would teach the Drex a lesson about humanity, instead, and explained that humans did not surrender and did not back down and definitely did not let bullies push them around no matter how big their fleet happened to be. He told Craxus that if he wanted this colony, he would have to come and take it by force. Jake cut the channel before Craxus could respond, and around him his bridge crew sat in stunned silence for a moment, before his tactical officer spoke up and said that what he just did was either the bravest or most insane thing she had ever heard. Jake admitted it was probably both, but pointed out that those were their people down on the planet and their families, and they would hold the line here no matter what the cost. The 8 human ships formed a defensive screen between the Drex fleet and New Horizon, and it was a tiny barrier against a massive hammer, but they held formation with determined precision. Fighter craft launched from the Guardian and Sentinel, creating tiny sparks of defiance against impossible odds. The Drex fleet advanced slowly with almost contemptuous confidence, because they clearly expected the humans to break and run like every other species had done when faced with overwhelming force. When the distance closed to weapons range and the human fleet still held position, Craxus made his first mistake by underestimating them completely. Craxus ordered all vessels to open fire and destroy the human ships, but leave the colony intact, because they would need it as an example. The Drex fleet opened up with energy weapons, sending crimson lances of plasma across space that had destroyed countless vessels during their centuries of conquest. But the human ships began to move in patterns the Drex had not anticipated, and instead of traditional combat formations, they fought like Earthfighter pilots, using 3-dimensional space to their advantage and covering each other with overlapping fire. Human railguns spat tungsten projectiles at relativistic speeds that punched through Drex armor like it was paper. Missiles with adaptive warheads hunted for vulnerable spots in enemy ships and exploited every weakness they could find. The smaller, human ships were faster and more maneuverable than the Drex vessels, and they used those advantages to stay one step ahead of the incoming fire. The corvette Rapid Strike took a direct hit that vaporized its starboard side and killed everyone aboard instantly. But even as it died, its final missile volley crippled a Drex cruiser and sent it spinning out of formation. The destroyer Sentinel lost its main engines to a plasma strike, but continued firing from a stationary position because its captain refused to abandon his post, even as enemy fire converged on his location from multiple directions. Melissa reported that they had multiple breaches on decks 3 and 5, and their shields were at 40% and dropping fast. But she also reported that they were hurting the enemy badly, with 7 Drex ships destroyed, and 14 damaged enough to pull back from the front line. Jake watched his tactical display as another corvette winked out of existence and disappeared forever. 3 ships lost in the first 30 minutes, and at this rate, they would not last 2 hours, much less the 15 they needed. Then something unexpected happened that changed everything. Melissa shouted that they had new contacts and they were Arcorian signatures coming in at high speed. Multiple vessels were entering the system and moving to engage the Drex fleet. Hope surged through Jake's chest like electricity, because the mutual defense treaty was real, and the Arcorians were actually honoring it. 35 Arcorian warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and immediately engaged the Drex fleet from the flank with precision strikes. The Arcorians were skilled warriors in their own right, and their ships were built for speed and accuracy rather than brute force. The Drex formation broke apart as they tried to face this new threat from an unexpected direction, and in that moment of confusion, Jake saw an opportunity that might not come again. Jake ordered all ships to go to full attack pattern and hit the enemy while they were disorganized and told them to launch all remaining ordnance. The human fleet surged forward wounded but unbroken, and the Guardians' forward railguns found their mark on a Drex dreadnought's command section, causing secondary explosions. The Arcorian fleet concentrated their fire on the enemy's heavy units, with tactics that were clearly practiced and professional. War leader Craxus found his perfect victory turning into a brutal slugging match that was costing him ships and prestige. He had expected the humans to fold quickly, and he had not anticipated their allies arriving, or that the humans themselves would fight with such desperate ferocity. Despite catastrophic losses, Craxus ordered his fleet to pull back to defensive formation and concentrate fire on the human vessels, but it was already too late. The momentum had shifted in a way he could not reverse, and the Drex had lost the psychological advantage. More importantly, they had revealed something critical to everyone watching, and that was, they could be hurt, and they could be beaten. The battle raged for 12 more hours in a grinding fight that left debris fields and radiation scars across the New Horizons system. The human fleet lost 5 more ships to enemy fire, and the Arcorians lost 8 of their vessels. But they held the line against all odds, and when Admiral Morrison's relief fleet finally arrived with 3 6 weeks after the Battle of New Horizon, the Galactic Council met in emergency session, and what should have been a simple matter of disciplining one upstart species had become an existential crisis that threatened everything they had built. The assembly floor buzzed with anxious conversation as representatives from across known space gathered to address the growing chaos that was spreading through their carefully ordered civilization like a virus. Ambassador Lisa Grant stood in the human delegation area, and she was now joined by 10 Arcorian diplomats and, surprisingly, 3 Valurian observers who had come. Despite their species still being council members, Earth had gone from having no friends in the galaxy to building a small but growing coalition of species willing to challenge the council's authority and question whether the old ways were really the best ways. Counselor Frex called the session to order, and his silver scales seemed duller than they had been months ago, as if the stress was physically affecting him. He announced that this assembly convened to address the ongoing human situation and the deteriorating unity of the council, because in the 6 weeks since the engagement at New Horizons 17, species had formally withdrawn from sanctions against humanity. 8 more had suspended enforcement and trade. Networks were disrupted and defense coordination was compromised, and the council had to act decisively before things got even worse. The Mirantine representative spoke next, and its crystalline form refracted the chamber lights in dizzying patterns as it declared that the solution was obvious. Humanity had to be brought to heel by overwhelming force, and the Drex had failed because they acted alone without proper support. The council needed to authorize a coalition fleet drawn from multiple species and large enough that resistance would be impossible and the humans would have no choice but to surrender. Murmurs of agreement rippled through portions of the assembly, But they were countered by equally vocal opposition from species who were not so sure that military action was the right answer. The Valurian ambassador rose and her compound eyes scanned the chamber as she spoke, and asked why 17 species had chosen to ignore the sanctions. She suggested that perhaps humanity's position had merit and they had only asked to be treated as equals rather than subjects. And was that truly so unreasonable a request? The Drex War Council representative was still bitter from their defeat at New Horizon, and he snapped that humans were children in galactic terms. Their civilization was barely 100 years spacefaring, and they could not be trusted with full sovereignty because they did not understand how things worked. Lisa requested permission to speak, and after a tense pause, Vrex granted it with obvious reluctance. She walked to the center floor, and her voice was clear and confident as she addressed the assembled species and told them what had happened. In the 6 weeks while they debated what to do about humanity, Lisa activated a holographic display that showed trade routes and economic data flowing across known space in streams of light. She explained that human merchants had opened trade relationships with 43 species despite the sanctions, and their goods were popular because they were high quality and fairly priced. Humanity was not undercutting anyone through deception or cheating, but was simply competing honestly in the marketplace. The display shifted to show humanitarian missions and medical relief efforts. Lisa continued by stating that human medical ships had provided disaster relief to 3 different species facing natural catastrophes, and they had shared agricultural technology with colonies struggling with crop failures. Human vessels had rescued 6 different ships from pirates or equipment failures, and they had done all of this without asking for anything in return and without checking whether the species they were helping were council members enforcing sanctions against them. The display changed, again to show military operations in border regions. Lisa explained that the Arcorian Human Defensive Alliance had conducted 17 joint operations against raiders and slavers in areas where the council had been noticeably absent. They were making space safer for everyone, regardless of political affiliations or council membership status. Lisa paused and let her words sink into the minds of those listening before she asked what exactly was the threat that humanity posed. They were not conquering anyone or forcing their way of life on other species, and they were simply refusing to surrender their independence to an organization that demanded obedience rather than earning respect. The real question everyone should be asking was why so many species were starting to agree with humanity's position. The chamber erupted in heated debate, with some representatives calling her words treasonous propaganda, while others quietly nodded in agreement. The unity that had held the council together for 12,000 years was visibly cracking like ice on a warming lake. In a private chamber off the main assembly floor, a group of influential species representatives met in secret, away from the cameras and recording devices. The Gentari delegation leader was an amphibious being whose species controlled significant trade infrastructure across multiple systems, and she addressed the gathered group with brutal honesty. She said bluntly that the council was dying not because of humanity, but because humanity had exposed what many of them had known for centuries. The council served the interests of its most powerful members, while the rest were expected to comply with rules they had no voice in creating. The Corvian ambassador was a being of avian features, and he clicked his beak in agreement. His government had been considering withdrawal for years because the council's trade regulations favored the established powers, and its military protection was inconsistent. They paid dues and followed rules while receiving minimal benefits in return. The Gentari leader admitted that the reason most species stayed was fear of standing alone in a dangerous galaxy. But humanity had shown it was possible to be independent, and they had stood alone and found allies and survived against all predictions. If they could do it as a young species, then why could not others do the same? The Corvian leaned forward and revealed that he had been authorized to tell them that his government was considering formal withdrawal from the Galactic Council. They would seek to join or form an alternative organization based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical control, and if other species were interested, they would welcome discussions. The meeting continued for hours with similar sentiments echoed by representatives from a dozen species. None of them were major powers individually, but together they represented significant economic and military capabilities. More importantly, they represented an idea that was spreading like wildfire, and that was the Galactic Council was no longer the only option for civilized species. Back on Earth, Admiral Morrison reviewed intelligence reports in his office while Colonel Nathan Price sat across from him looking as exhausted as Morrison felt. Nathan explained that they were seeing something unprecedented in galactic history, and the Council was fracturing into 3 distinct factions. The hardliners, led by the Drex and Mirantine, wanted to crush humanity militarily, while the moderates, which surprisingly included Councillor Vrex, were pushing for negotiation and compromise. There was also a growing reform faction that wanted to completely restructure the Council to be less authoritarian. Morrison asked how many species were in each faction, and Nathan replied that roughly 60 species were in the hardline camp while 100 were in the moderate group. The reform faction was growing but currently numbered about 40, with the rest undecided or staying neutral. But the critical part was that the reformers were talking about withdrawal and forming a new organization that they were calling the Alliance of Free Worlds. Morrison leaned back in his chair and asked if they were really forming an alternative to the Council. Nathan confirmed it and added that they wanted humanity to be a founding member because humans had gone from galactic pariahs to the catalyst for the biggest political upheaval in recorded history. A priority message arrived from Ambassador Grant, and Morrison opened it quickly. He read the contents and then looked up at Nathan with something approaching disbelief. The moderate faction was requesting formal negotiations, and they wanted to discuss terms for human council membership without the submission requirements. Vrex was personally extending the invitation. As a gesture of good faith, Nathan asked if they would accept the invitation, and Morrison thought about the 50,000 settlers on New Horizon who had nearly died for the principle of human independence. He thought about the crew members lost defending that principle against overwhelming odds. He said they would talk, but they were not, backing down from their core position because humanity would join the Council as equals or not at all. 3 days later, secret negotiations began on a neutral station in unclaimed space far from prying eyes. The human delegation and the Arcorian alliance partners met with the moderate Council faction behind closed doors. Surprisingly, several reformist species sent observers, and even more surprisingly, the Drex sent a single representative to watch the proceedings, though they refused to participate directly in the talks. The negotiations were tense from the very beginning. The moderate faction wanted humanity to make concessions on military expansion and accept limited oversight from Council peacekeepers. The humans refused completely, and 3 months after the negotiations began, representatives from 28 species gathered on humanity's orbital station above Earth, and the assembly chamber had been hastily expanded to accommodate the delegation. Unlike the imposing grandeur of the Galactic Council chambers, this space felt more welcoming and more focused on equality, because seats were arranged in concentric circles rather than hierarchical tiers. There was no elevated platform for senior members to look down on others, and everyone met at eye level as equals should. Admiral Morrison stood at the center of the chamber, now designated as the first security coordinator of what they were calling the Free Systems Alliance. Beside him, Ambassador Lisa Grant prepared to open the founding session, while the Arcorian Prime Minister named Corthax sat in the front row next to the Valurian Chief Ambassador and the Corvian Confederacy representative. Lisa activated the holographic display showing a star map where member systems glowed in blue, while the remaining Galactic Council systems showed in red. The map told a story that would have seemed impossible just months ago, because the Council still commanded the majority of known space. But the Free Systems Alliance controlled strategic trade routes and resource-rich systems. Perhaps most importantly, they controlled the ideological high ground because they stood for freedom rather than submission. Lisa began by saying that 3 months ago, humanity rejected the Galactic Council's demand for submission, and today, they stood as the founding members of an alliance built on principles that should have been universal from the start. Self-determination and mutual respect and voluntary cooperation were not radical ideas, but somehow the Council had forgotten them over 12,000 years. They were not here to replace tyranny with another form of control, but to prove that free peoples could work together for common benefit without surrendering their sovereignty. The Corvian ambassador spread his wings in his species' gesture of agreement and announced that the Alliance Charter was ready for ratification. Unlike the Council's complex hierarchy of protocols and submission requirements, their charter was simple and straightforward. Each member species maintained complete sovereignty over its territory and internal affairs while the Alliance existed, to facilitate trade and coordinate defense against external threats and provide a forum for resolving disputes peacefully. Membership required only two commitments, which were respect for the sovereignty of other members and a pledge to defend each other if attacked by outside forces. Korthax added that there would be no forced compliance with domestic policy choices, and no economic sanctions for internal decisions, and no cultural imperialism trying to make every species the same. They were diverse peoples with different values and ways of life, and the Alliance celebrated that diversity rather than trying to destroy it. The ratification was unanimous, as 28 species representing billions of citizens across hundreds of systems formally established the Free Systems Alliance. It was a fraction of the galaxy, but it was a powerful start, and more importantly, it represented a fundamental challenge to the old order that had dominated for so long. Back in the Galactic Council chambers, the mood was far darker than anyone could remember. The assembly had shrunk visibly, with empty seats marking where species had withdrawn, and the remaining members fell into roughly two camps. The hardliners wanted to crush the Alliance through military force, while others recognized that such action would likely drive even more species to withdraw. Councillor Vrex addressed the depleted assembly with barely contained frustration in his voice. The Council faced its greatest crisis in recorded history, with 28 species withdrawn and another 47 declaring neutral status, refusing to participate in either organization. Their authority was evaporating like water in vacuum, and their trade networks were disrupted and their combined defense structure was compromised. They had to decide their path forward before there was no council left to lead. The Drex representative slammed a heavy limb against his podium hard enough to crack it, and declared that the path was clear. They needed to assemble their combined military forces and crush this rebellion completely. They would make an example of humanity and its allies, and show the galaxy what happened to those who defied the Council's authority. The Mirantine representative, who had surprisingly shifted toward a more moderate position, asked if driving every neutral species into the Alliance's arms was really their goal. Intelligence suggested that at least 20 neutral species were watching closely to see how the Council responded, and military aggression would be seen as proof that the humans were right about them all along. Councillor Heston, who had observed the negotiations, rose from his seat and proposed an alternative approach. They should acknowledge the reality of their situation because the Council as it existed was finished. But that did not mean cooperation between their species had to end completely. He suggested they open diplomatic channels with the Free Systems Alliance and discuss terms for peaceful coexistence, and perhaps even eventual merger into a new galactic organization that incorporated the best elements of both structures. The chamber erupted in heated debate, with the hardliners calling Heston a traitor, while the moderates praised his pragmatism. For hours they argued back and forth, but no consensus emerged from the chaos. Finally, in an unprecedented move, Councillor Vrex called for a formal vote on three options, which were military action against the Alliance or diplomatic engagement, or maintaining the hostile status quo while neither attacking nor negotiating. The vote was fragmented in a way that showed just how broken the Council had become. 37% favored military action, while 42% supported diplomatic engagement, and 21% wanted to maintain the status quo. Without a clear majority, the Council found itself paralyzed and unable to act decisively in any direction. The Drex representative stormed out, declaring that his species would act independently if the Council lacked the courage to defend itself. 3 other hardline species followed him out of the chamber, and it was another crack in the already damaged unity. Meanwhile, in human space, Captain Ryan Mitchell received new orders that made him smile with genuine satisfaction. The Valiant had been assigned to lead a joint patrol with Arcorian and Valurian vessels, establishing the first integrated Alliance defense squadron. His crew worked alongside aliens, not as reluctant partners in a forced alliance, but as willing colleagues working toward shared goals. Lieutenant Amy Peterson commented during their first joint patrol exercise that it was strange because 3 months ago they were pariahs, and now they were helping write the rulebook for how species interacted in this region of space. Mitchell watched his tactical display showing the positions of his ship and its alien partners, moving in coordinated patterns, and replied that they had forced the galaxy to think about what kind of civilization it wanted to be. The Council thought they could bully humanity into submission, and when humans refused, it revealed how fragile their authority really was. The joint patrol encountered no threats during its first week, which was probably for the best given how much the crews needed to learn about each other's tactics and communications protocols. But on day 8, they intercepted a distress call from a civilian transport under attack by raiders in a neutral system. The raiders were better armed than usual and clearly expected easy prey. What they got instead was a coordinated response from 3 different species warships that had been training together. The Valiant's railguns provided long-range fire support while the Arcorian ships used their superior speed for flanking maneuvers. The Valurian vessel, equipped with advanced electronic warfare systems, jammed the raiders' communications and targeting systems completely. The engagement was over in minutes, with the raiders either destroyed or fleeing for their lives. The civilian transport captain, representing a species that had remained neutral in the Council alliance split, broadcast his gratitude and confusion. He said he was not sure what to call them because they were not Council peacekeepers, but they were not raiders themselves. So what exactly were they? Mitchell smiled and replied that they were just neighbors looking out for each other because that was what the alliance did. The story of the rescue spread across neutral systems, and it was one of dozens of similar incidents that demonstrated the alliance could provide security and support without the bureaucratic overhead and political strings attached to Council membership. Slowly but surely, neutral species began to lean toward joining the alliance. 6 months after humanity's rejection of the Council's ultimatum, the galaxy had fundamentally reorganized itself in ways no one had predicted. The Free Systems Alliance numbered 46 member species and continued to grow. The Galactic Council retained its largest and most powerful members, but had lost the universal authority it once commanded. A large neutral zone of species aligned with neither organization served as a buffer and testing ground for both approaches to galactic governance. Admiral Morrison met with Lisa Grant in his office reviewing the latest status reports, and they had both aged noticeably in the past 6 months. The stress of leading humanity through this crisis had taken its toll on both of them, but they had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Lisa said they had received another membership apply,